Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Param Eftekhari. I'm the founder and chairperson of the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology and the Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the Cybersecurity Collaborative. And I am absolutely thrilled to welcome all of you to our virtual briefing today entitled Interactive Security Testing, DevSecOps, and NIST SP 853 Rev 5. I must say, we have broken records here at ICIT with this virtual panel. We had over 700 people register for this webinar, so we are thrilled for all of you to joining us here today. We are grateful for our panelists, which I'll be introducing in a moment. We, of course, as always, want to thank our co-chairs for today's briefing, AWS, Checkmarks, and our fellow program member, DLT, a tech data company, who we've been working with for over 4 years now on a number of educational efforts, from Briefing the Hill to doing events like this to research publications. And so as a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, without partners like these and the experts that you're going to be talking to today, none of this would be made possible. So we're really grateful for everyone's time. I want to just briefly, talk about today's dialogue. Essentially, we're here to talk about how we can harden the technology that we're using across our public sectors and throughout our new digital world. This is a topic that we've been talking about for many, many years now, but it continues to be important. And actually, one of the ways that we're going to go ahead and start the conversation is to put this in some context. We know that the vulnerabilities that are being exploited by adversaries, both nation state and cyber criminal, ultimately come down to the fact that the technology that's being deployed, whether it's software or hardware, is at the end of the day riddled with exploitable vulnerabilities. And we need to talk about what we can do to reduce those vulnerabilities from being introduced into the wild in the first place. And once we reduce that, then we can talk about bolting on security, which we do need as part of a layered security strategy after the fact. And so we've assembled an all-star panel of experts to have a phenomenal conversation around that. So if we can go to the next slide, we're going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. Of course, we have Dr. Ron Ross, a fellow at NIST, and our 2019 ICIT pioneer, who we honored at last year's gala. Ron, it's great to have you here. We have Tim Anderson, an ICIT contributor and a senior security advisor from AWS. We have Jeff Shaw, an ICIT contributor and a security solutions engineer from Checkmarks. And of course, we have our very own executive director, Joyce Hunter, who was also the former deputy CIO for policy and planning at the USDA. So everyone, it's great to have you here. We're going to go ahead and jump right into the conversation. If you see me looking to my right, I'm going to be looking at the questions as well. So I just want to start off by putting this conversation into context. This topic is so important to national security and so many of the security conversations we're having. But I think before we get into the nuts and bolts of why it is that we're need to do DevSecOps and embed security into the process, let's talk about what would happen if we don't do this and what's really at stake for our governments and for the country at large. And so I want to throw this out to the group to help us really understand what's at stake here and why this is such an important topic.
Well, I'll just jump in, Parm, and say that I think we're living through an unprecedented time. Not only are we in this massive pandemic, but we continue to see the emergence of new technologies. The technology revolution is going faster and faster by the day. And I think that this is one of the most important issues of our time, because this massive convergence of cyber and physical systems that we're seeing and the phenomenal new technology that we love to use, it's causing a great dependency on the technology, and it's going into everything that we care about. And so I think this panel today, it's very timely, because we have to be able to trust the technology, not to operate in just routine day-to-day operations, but in critical situations. And the fact is that our industry produces the greatest technology in the world, and it's doing phenomenal things, but it's also very complex. We're literally producing trillions of lines of code billions of devices, and all of this is, I call this the great system stack, and it gives us great capabilities, and there's ubiquitous connectivity going from 4G now to 5G. And so this complexity issue continues to haunt us because the adversary really has the advantage in a complex systems world. And so, when we talk about, I use the metaphor of the black box, which is really just a way of saying, whether it's your smartphone or your tablet or your desktop, your laptop, or a supercomputer, understanding the system stack, and that includes the applications, the middleware, the operating system, the integrated circuits firmware, and the network. You have to have some understanding of what's going on inside that black box in order to be able to trust it. And so I think on today's panel, we're going to be talking about a lot of important things. NIST 853, I'll talk about some of the improvements there, but talking about DevSecOps and building security into the life cycle, this is not just a problem for consumers. This is a shared problem of both producers of information technology and consumers. We both have a very important part to play in the overall solution, and I would argue that this is an imperative that we have to go forward with, because there's too much at risk if we don't solve some of these great and challenging problems.
And to add to that, I mean, software is everywhere nowadays, right? And our demand for technology is just insatiable, and their demand for applications is growing exponentially. And the problem with that is that everything's going much faster. Couple that with the complexity, it just makes us very, very error prone. And baking security into the beginning is the way to go. Especially as you mentioned earlier, cybercrime has really become a profession. It's organized, it's state sponsored, it's profitable, right? So if you have an exploitation or if you have vulnerability in your app, it's going to get exploited. It's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to make security a shared responsibility. Tools and technology is just not enough, and we'll address this a little bit later when we start talking about culture. Security personnel, as both Ron and Jeff has talked about, need to be brought into the process early and often. Security people are critical to success, and including them is not just a one-time only move. They have to be integrated into the development teams as this way of working. And sometimes it's referred to as a shift left, as we are shifting to focus on security to the left of the overall timeline.
Yeah, I tend to always like to look at it as, you think of your critical application or systems as a dam, and then you have this cartoonish security practitioner running around trying to plug all the holes that are springing open of it. And honestly, what really needs to be done is getting the engineers, architects, in order to build a highly resilient dam, in order for those practitioners to really refocus right on the key elements in protecting the whole visibility of it.
Yeah, these are all great points. I just an hour and a half ago, I was a panelist on another virtual briefing. It was a very specific topic around personalization for retirement planning and other kind of financial technologies. And I was a security expert on that discussion, and I was able to talk about these very issues and talking to this group about the importance of, as they're building these new applications and these new capabilities to provide value to their consumers, the importance of embedding technology, embedding security into the development process. And I'll share that it was actually very heartening to hear that while the questions they were asking were focused on how to make this happen, how to bridge the dots, and Joyce kind of hinted on this, between the right stakeholders within the organization. A compliance person asked, does that mean I have to become a security expert now? And I said, no, talk to your CISO, get them to support you. But you were just seeing so many applications of how this hardening of the code and hardening of technology is going to have potentially positive outcomes if done correctly, but potentially catastrophic outcomes on a number of levels if we don't address it. And of course, that's why we're here today. So a great way to start off this dialogue. Ron, I think the next place I want to go to is to you. Given that there was some recent revisions to NIST 800-53, I think it'd be really beneficial for us to start the conversation with just a brief update from you as to what some of those revisions are, what some of those updates were, specifically as well, including what's been added with respect to DevSecOps. So if we can start with that, that'd be great.
Well, first, I want to thank all of our customers for being so patient. This update's been going on for a long time, but we're finally coming to the end of the road here. We received over 2,000 comments in the last round of the final public draft, and we're going through each one of those, and we're very close to completing that final markup, and so it won't be too much longer. I think some of the big things that you're going to see in 853 Rev 5 is that, first and foremost, we've made the controls more outcome-based, which is what our customers were asking for. We've simplified it and made every one of them very outcome-based, which is going to help in many aspects. The other thing we've done is we've made the control catalog consumable by multiple constituents. Up to this point, the control catalog has been used by mostly enterprise folks in the federal agencies, but within industry, a lot of industry partners use the controls in the engineering process. So we took out our baselines, which are our recommendations for the sets of controls for low and moderate and high impact systems, moved that to a separate document so those controls can be used by people in enterprise situations, or they can be used by systems engineers as they're building security, as Joyce talked about, into the life cycle. Some of the big things we've done, and I've been at this for, as you know, about 15 or 16 years. This catalog is the best catalog we've ever done. It has the greatest breadth and depth of safeguards and countermeasures. We've actually integrated privacy into the control catalog fully. It's not just an appendix anymore. The privacy controls have their own family, and they're actually integrated into several security controls where those controls have both privacy and security implications. We have a whole set of controls now for system security engineering. So we can actually implement some of those security design principles, put those requirements into contracts so our partners can understand what we need as far as protecting these systems. But I think the biggest thing that is going to happen with DevSecOps, and this is the part that is going to be a huge cost saver for the federal government, if we can actually get the security integrated into the life cycle as a routine process. And we're going to talk about that integrated testing that you had on as one of the objectives today as well. If a lot of that testing can be done by the developers as part of their normal life cycle, which they do anyway, and they can convey that evidence to the customers out there, we can save an awful lot of work on the back end of that process. We spend an enormous amount of money in assessments on these security controls. And if we can, as Joyce was saying, move all this process left and get some of that testing and evaluation done as part of the development process and convey the results to all of the customers, that's going to save a tremendous amount of money. And we can then put that money back into even better security. So we have a tremendous amount of great things coming out in Rev 5, and I'm just excited as could be. It won't be too much longer, so hopefully within the next month or two.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And we know how hard you and your team work on these revisions. So the community is happy and glad to be patient for these quality documents, Ron. So don't worry about that. We're gonna pause for one moment, and Drew, if you don't mind pulling up the poll before we get into the questions, we wanted to get some audience feedback. So Drew, if you can pull up that poll, we're gonna ask you guys to take a moment, answer a question, and we'll incorporate this answer into the kickoff of the conversation. So just take a few moments to read through that, and we'll pull up the results in a moment. Just leave it up for a few moments. And ironically, as we were preparing for this discussion, we saw a lot of panels around, articles around this topic. So the question was that we saw from a recent study, 52% of companies admitted to sacrificing security to meet project deadlines. What do you think is your driver behind this? Interestingly enough, most of you said developers are not properly trained in cybersecurity. Second most popular answer operations teams are pushing back on security practices. Not many of you said that your organization doesn't sacrifice security to meet projects. So that's a good segue into the question here. And I think, you know, this really underscores the fact that embedding security in the DevOps process is not a new topic, but we keep talking about it. It keeps coming up. And so, hey, Joe, I think we can take this off the screen and go back to the, thank you. So, you know, I think a good place to start giving those metrics and looking at those numbers is to have a conversation as to why does this keep being a challenge and an issue, and you know, what do you think are some of the most common pitfalls? And again, the reason we put together this expert panel is there's a lot of different perspectives. We have industry represented, we have the government perspective. So I'd like to get kind of a good diverse set of views here. But what are some of the most common challenges and pitfalls that are stalling progress that we know would drive the outcomes we're looking for?
Well, I'll jump in again. I think one of the problems is that, you know, industry is doing a great job in building products and systems for us. But I think a lot of the problem comes that we don't, as customers sometimes or consumers, we don't convey our security requirements very well as part of the acquisition process. That's one of the first things we can do a lot better. And there are several documents. The NIST 853 is one of the documents where you can use those controls to express as requirements to industry on what things you think are important that are coming out of those products and system development life cycles. But I think the other thing that's happened is that we've stovepiped security for the past 40 years. We've created a whole industry of cybersecurity professionals, and a lot of the problems that we're talking about today can be solved by software developers and system engineers. We don't necessarily have to have cybersecurity people embedded in those projects, but we have to be able to convey those basic cybersecurity principles and concepts and techniques in a way that the system engineers and the software engineers can use those to actually affect the outcome of how that code is developed and the strengths of the code and some of the things that we really care about. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity here in this whole notion of DevOps and passing along some of our 40 years of best practices to the development community and having a conversation. Instead of being adversaries, let's work on the same team and try to pass our knowledge to the people who actually build software and systems. That's where the rubber meets the road. And every time we do a better job at integrating those security requirements early, left in that life cycle, that means those requirements are they're going to turn into architectural and design decisions. And those are going to go through the entire life cycle and end up with better products, safer, more secure products that we can all use and depend on.
Yeah, I think traditionally that stovepiping has been a common characteristic of all security, where you would wait till the very end to run that BAS scan, and what would happen is you would develop the entire application, and then you get handed this really huge report of all the things you have to fix, right? You know, with the invent of moving things to the left, you can start getting some of those technologies that are more into the hands of your developers, which ultimately that's where any kind of fix has to occur. You know, I think in the new version of the 853, IS has been included here, and IS is a technology where you can actually do application security testing on a live application. Prior to that, most folks would wait until the application was developed. Now there's no reason to do that. You just, you know, add it in. So as you get more and more of these findings up front, developers can address them when they're more comfortable, and it's less of a fire drill.
Yeah, I think from a higher. Oh, please go ahead, Joyce.
I think it's also reluctance to integrate, just what like Ron and Andrew were saying. Integration of teams, and this goes back to culture, right? Enable teams to work in tandem with each other instead of independent of each other. Pipes, and not everybody is going to be ready to jump on overnight. The process happens gradually, and we're so used to this microwave era in fast food, drive up to pick up your package and run, that people have become deeply accustomed to the current development processes, and it's hard to break the system and adopt new ways of working. Comfort tends to triumph over exploring the familiar. Unfamiliar is uncomfortable. For this, the right processes and tools are required, and the time needs to be permitted for people to make a transition.
Yeah, and I think actually to attach on to what Joyce was saying, to sort of underscore the cultural shift that's needed and the executive commitment, right? You need executive sponsorship. You need the runway in order to, especially if this was your first foray into DevSecOps, the runway to actually build and resource appropriately. And it's critical that you actually have the underpinning of the executive structure of the organization, because you are going to have to do so much cross collaboration with different business units, different entities, as well as, and this is imperative, having security, and I implore all the security practitioners leading the way, building those communities of practice, helping inculcate that culture of security, and really recognizing security as a function of quality, right? You need to equate it with a base element of software quality, where you do test design and you go through the business value of that release code.
You can't take these vulnerabilities and try to keep them as these mystical items here. I mean, reality, a security vulnerability is a defect, right? And if you treat them that way, that's the language everyone understands. And you want people to talk about it. You know, don't wait till the end. Don't keep it as something that's shameful. Include it in your development process, add it to your backlog, and just move forward with it.
Yeah, let's dig in. I'm sorry, Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you look at the security controls in 853, we used to define them in 3 different categories: management, operational, and technical. And we don't do that anymore, but they're still basically across the board representing people, processes, and technologies. So security is really multifaceted. And I think, as Joyce was saying earlier, this is a totally shared responsibility. And you know, so when it comes to implementing security controls at the enterprise level, we can do an awful lot of developing a response plan, contingency plan. We can talk about using 2-factor authentication or doing a multitude of things that will help protect our systems. But when you actually talk about the technical controls, things like access control mechanisms or encryption or identification authentication, all of those things are literally buried in the black box that I talked about earlier. They're in hardware, software, and firmware. And so all of that becomes the shared responsibility part of industry. And I think that's what the critical part of the DevSecOps and the cultural shift. I think we're all in this together. And we can't put blame on industry, and we can't blame the consumers. Each of us has a role to play. And knowing what controls we need, how those controls are implemented, and how we can get some degree of assurance that the controls that we selected, that we've implemented, whether it's on the industry side or whether it's on the government or the private sector consumer side, we have to have the ability to have that assurance and trust those components and the systems that we're using, especially if they're going into critical applications, critical infrastructure, medical devices. There are some things that cannot fail, otherwise people are going to die. And I think that will help move the culture when people finally realize this massive cyber physical convergence and how little we actually know about what's in the black box. That should really scare everyone and cause us to work together toward a better solution.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the cultural piece in a moment. We'll get there, but you know, on that note, can you guys share, you know, specific examples of, you know, how this has been done right, whether it's examples you've worked on within agencies for customers, you know, for agencies that you've been a part of, or if there's programs out there, because I think, you know, one of the things we want to make sure we can have for the audience is, as much as possible, some good use cases that are out there, or examples that they can walk away, you know, being able to have some lessons learned in terms of how to take some of those ideas we just talked about and be able to implement them within their organization. So I was wondering if you could share some positive examples of how security was embedded into the development process and the outcomes that it did drive.
I've got a couple examples. For the most part, most of the customers that we deal with that are successful have a really good, clear line of communication. Their communication channels are very clear. They have wiki pages. They have, weekly meetings. They have knowledge centers, and they're very, very open to discussing vulnerabilities. It's never very adversarial, right? They all talk together. They all communicate very well. The other thing that's really good about some of these customers is that they're never complacent. They're always so-called trying to sharpen the saw, right? So we had a customer that for 6 years had an AppSec program, and for the most part, it was running very well. They came to us and then they asked, how can we improve it? And gave them some information, gave them some tools to work with, and they embraced it. They started working with it. They're always looking for new information. They're always looking for things like, the API security, things of that nature, things that are going to be coming up on the forefront. They don't get complacent and say, hey, I've got a program, it's running, I don't have to touch it. It's always evolving, they're always changing. Those tend to be the ones that usually are successful.
Yeah, I agree. A few common success patterns I've seen are one, security being able to engage the teams early for things like threat modeling, things that require some high judgment interaction where you're not necessarily going to automate that very well. In order to build those test cases, that test automation that goes in there, and then really have that interaction and security be able to artifact off of that and see those guardrails and actually establish those, remove the gates, let them run a little bit. And really it's about confidence building as these teams get better and we've seen success grow. Maybe they can't deploy to production right away, but as they're artifacting off, security gains assurance because of visibility into their pipelines, then they start removing those gates and you start being able to run at the pace that you can handle while security keeps an oversight. And that's generally been a pattern that I've seen recurring.
Yeah, I think there's not a lot of examples yet because DevSecOps is fairly new. It's been going on a while, but I think one of the folks that I've been interacting with, the Air Force Chief Software Officer, Nick Shalane, he's been doing a lot of things in the DevSecOps area for the Air Force, and he's doing things in systems that are pretty darn important. The weapon systems, things that have to be absolutely bulletproof. And he's using all of the new technologies, new ideas, new thinking around DevSecOps with containers and tool chains. And it basically, he's a disruptor. And I think one of the things that goes back to the cultural question is sometimes when we're used to doing things the same way, it's really hard to get people out of that box. I mean, we're creatures of habit. And I think this happens in the federal government on steroids because it's really hard sometimes to innovate. We saw this with cloud computing back in 2009. I don't think we're still fully into the cloud, but there's always going to be people dragging their feet and being risk averse. But this is one of those times in history where we have to take advantage of the new technology. We can't let security be an inhibitor of that technology. So when you're talking about a lot of the DevOps processes, they're using agile lifecycle approaches, agile approaches to development. And so one of the challenges that we'd like to address at NIST is if we can create I'm using a generic term called a DevSecOps framework, not to change the way people do their DevSecOps processes, but capture what are the best practices when you're doing DevSecOps. And let's say you're using agile development approaches. If you try to impose the NIST 800-160 14 technical processes that we got out of the international standard on the agile process, I'd like to understand what parts of those traditional lifecycle processes are applicable to agile and which ones are a little bit more difficult. Try to work out the differences, find the gaps, because we've got to be able to keep that technology moving forward at the speed of commercial industry and yet help make that new technology as secure as it needs to be. And we realize it's never going to be perfect, and that's why we've talked about this multi-dimensional protection strategy where you try to stop the bad guys at the front door with penetration resistance, but given the fact that a certain percentage of those high-end adversaries are going to get into some of your critical systems, we have to be able to move into a more resiliency mode. And that means limiting the damage the adversaries can do, both using things like zero trust architectures and zero trust concepts, lots of virtualization, micro-virtualization, segmentation, micro-segmentation. This is where, as Tim was talking about, you have to get under the hood. And resiliency is about architecture and engineering. And that's something that we're not doing as much as we should right now, but that is going to be the ultimate solution. So our systems will act more like our human body immune systems and be able to fend off some of those really bad attacks and not bring us down for the count.
And I think I can talk about a lot of those that aren't successful, but I'd be able to protect the guilty. I think, implement security in a continuous integration, continuous development that all of my colleagues are saying is extremely important. In order for DevSecOps to be successful, one cannot expect new DevOps processes to get to the old methods of security. It's like the old saying, between new wine and old wineskins. You have to be able to adapt and change and be able to ride shotgun the entire development process.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's interesting, as you all are the last several questions, so much of your comments, so many of your comments, excuse me, have really been focused on around concepts centered on communication and culture and processes between teams and teamwork. And so I really want to talk about that because, anyone who's, Ron's heard me say this a million times, Joyce has, because they've been to a lot of my events over the years, but technology is just the enabler. It really comes down to the people within the organization and the culture that you've built and the way you're able to communicate your goals and create a coalition of the willing, if you will, to accomplish and move the ball forward. And I think that once again, we're seeing that the tools that we have, whether it's this NIST framework or whether it's technology partners like AWS or Checkmarks or DLT or whomever we're talking about in this case, they're needed as part of the process, but you can give all that and all the money in the world to a dysfunctional team with a poor culture, and you're not going to get any good results. And so, again, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Not necessarily, we know that that's important, but for the people in the audience saying, yeah, and guess what? My culture sucks in my organization, and we know a lot of people have issues with communication, and they can't go to their boss. They feel that they are not supported. Security is not a priority. We saw the results of the poll. How do you overcome that? What are some tools to be able to elevate security as a priority, get buy-in, get all the right folks around the table? How do you overcome those challenges, which are oftentimes greater than and more difficult to overcome than the actual technical obstacles?
I think for culture, it's understanding that you're not by yourself. So it's not just the agency or within the agency. It's also the community around them. It's your integrators. It's your think tanks like ICIT. It's your AWS, it's your Checkmarks, your NIST. All these folks are all in it together. I mean, DevSecOps is a team sport, right? Everyone can contribute. Everyone has something to offer. And if you don't have that support within your organization, you can seek the other parts of your team to help you do that. I think no one wants to code insecurely. No one wants to have vulnerabilities. No one's purposely trying to do that. So if you're seeking help, folks will be willing to give it to you.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I think it.
Oh, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, so I think it sort of goes back to executive sponsorship, like that, and the lack of that as a pitfall. Because one of the things I've routinely seen where some organizations have had a little bit of success with DevSecOps, maybe they got one or two teams sort of rolling, but they're not scaling it across the enterprise because there's not overall buy-in and there's not the ability to transform that culture. So we're talking sort of fundamental cultural transformation for a lot of organizations. That means looking at things like tenants, your hiring practices, procurement practices, like all the interweaving of building teams that sort of build and desire the security effort of a quality function of an organization. And I think it's vital that when you're looking at sort of changing culture, and one of the things I say a lot to folks is the tooling, the processes, all of that stuff is not DevSecOps. DevSecOps is culture. All of those things go to underpin, reinforce, right, that cultural change. And once that's done, then they also add accuracy, speed, the elements of quality by doing the automation and tool chaining elements. But you really, if you want to expand it across the enterprise, it's really key to get a sort of top-down approach as far as building it across the cultural base, especially from what I've seen in public sector.
And in addition, everybody has to come to a definition of done. If you talk to my elementary school English teacher, she hates the word done. She always wants you to use the word finished. And software development in any kind of application, you're never finished, right? So when security stakeholders and development teams collaborate over testing or checks, that should be performed for each and every feature. The team has to make their definition, because otherwise you'll never get anything out the door. It ensures security features and quality features are built in. A team cannot complete their item until the security check has been, and that prevents a lot of heartache at the end with people looking for the ATO and not getting it.
Yeah, I think it comes back, Parm, you and I have talked about this a lot over the years. It's one word, it's called leadership. Leadership is not the same thing as management. It's a totally different skill set. Mm-hmm. And I think when you're talking about things of this level of importance, this is not just a company issue or one federal agency issue. This is a leadership issue that goes to the highest levels. And if you look at some of the great leaders who are disruptors in the tech space, I go back a long time when Bill Gates first started Microsoft, or Steve Jobs with Apple Computer. And you can see countless of examples of people like this. They have a common set of characteristics about them which make them great leaders. And this doesn't just apply to the tech sector, it applies really to everything. So it starts with a great vision. You have to be able to create that vision of where you want to go. And when you're talking about DevSecOps, we sometimes, as Tim was saying, we get stuck down in the weeds with all the details, and yet we don't create that big vision. And in the world of security, the nature of our business is kind of negative. We're always chasing the next vulnerability. We're always bringing bad news. We're always looking at the threats, and it can be depressing. But in order to break out of this mindset, you've got to create that broad vision of what these kind of things we're talking about today can actually achieve. And you've got to be optimistic. We can't run around with our hair on fire all the time, chasing that next vulnerability and saying the sky's falling. We have to be optimistic, and then we have to be able to have the charisma to be able to convince people of the kinds of things we're talking about, and have the passion to really bring home those arguments. And that's the way the culture gets changed ultimately. And when you bring all those things together, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to get the trust of people so they'll follow us in this journey that's going to be different than we've taken before. And some of the things we're talking about today, where we're going below the waterline, under the hood, so to speak, and we're relying on industry to do some of the testing and evaluation and convince us that they've done a good job. We've done this in other industries, like the auto industry. We have a lot of great examples of how industry has produced really reliable, safe products for consumers. And sometimes it's a combination of regulation and innovation. In the auto industry, the industry wanted to bring safer cars to consumers. And we saw the evolution of seatbelts to airbags to steel reinforced doors to engine compartments that drop down, and now a whole new generation of sensors. That same mentality, we can have the same type of mentality in our information technology industry and the consumers and producers working together. So I am optimistic, but I think it's going to take a fundamental mindset and very strong leadership at all levels to make this happen.
Yeah, those are all great points. And Ron, to your point, we've talked about the important role of leadership, and in the conversation I had a couple hours ago, we had that same conversation around that security is an enabler to these capabilities that they're looking to roll out. In that case, it was a financial sector, but it really takes leaders to not cause security to become a scapegoat to either prohibiting innovation, or to then, when there's an incident, pointing to the security team and saying they didn't do their job. It's really leadership to make sure that, no, we're going to roll out these systems, we're going to roll out these capabilities, we're going to drive value in whatever context it is that we're talking about, but we're going to do so responsibly in a secure manner to preserve the security and privacy of the customer, whatever that means, of the organization, and whatever the national security implication is, because we know that there always is, almost always is, a national security implication in virtually any sector that we're talking about. So very, very important. I'm going to go to a question that we had from the audience. We have several questions coming in. Thank you. We have literally hundreds of people on, so we cannot get to all of them. We apologize. But one of the ones that I thought was very interesting and timely is a panelist, audience member asked, how can organizations who want to do some of these things and move forward with increasing security and adhering to DevSecOps do so in an environment where everyone is distributed, and from a workforce perspective, because of the pandemic, and resources may be tighter. And we're talking about things such as creating tighter relationships between teams and changing culture. Some of that may be hard to do. So I don't expect anyone to have a magic wand, but do you have any tips or ideas on how they can overcome some challenges given the uncertain and kind of new times that we're living in today? That was an easy question, I know.
Well, it is I think we're all experiencing the same thing with the pandemic. So the separation is something that we're learning to live with, but I don't think it's stopped a lot of the collaboration. You can't necessarily sit next to your colleague, but you can certainly communicate. We're doing that today. And I can't tell you how many webinars I've been on since March like this, but there's a lot of them. I think the good news is that this is a common problem that exists across all sectors, because we all use the same computing technology, whether you're in the DoD building a weapon system, or medical device technology, or wherever you might be in these massive numbers of vertical sectors. And I think the first thing that we can do, the questioner was asking about, how do I get started? I think the first thing to do is to go back and have an understanding of what are the specific security requirements that you think are important for your enterprise, your organization. Everybody has a different mission and business function out there with their company. Understanding what the company does, what the mission is, what the business functions are, what technology you need to be successful, and then what steps do you have to take in order to protect the technology so you can carry out the mission. That's kind of, it sounds like 101, business 101, but that's a very important first step. And then I would encourage all of the customers, whether you're in public or private sector, to get to know some of the industry players who are using DevSecOps, and talk to them about the benefits of the technology. How does that process change the value proposition for getting security, the security you need into these components and the products that you need to build those systems that you depend on? Just becoming educated in what DevSecOps provides and how it can save you money. This always gets the attention of the senior leaders. If you can get better security and save money, now you're talking things that they understand they really want to hear. But it starts with a conversation and getting educated, and then using that knowledge, stepping out and trying to apply that and making significant changes to the way you do business.
Yeah, I mean, tying DevSecOps to a business case is what everyone should be doing, as far as getting the investments they need in order to, especially now that everyone's virtual, get the collaboration tools and other aspects that they really need to communicate and sort of foster the relationships they need to virtually. But with respect to like tool chaining and other things, like if you have internet access and you have some ingenuity as a builder, right? Like this is what we're looking for to start building up and being able to have these capabilities, right? These pipelines live in the cloud, or or your respective data centers, and they have the ability to use the dynamic testing tools, the API layers, everything that with internet connectivity and good communication software and systems, you can have a good collaborative environment that many industries right now are taking full advantage of because of the pandemic.
Nice things about these times of of Discord is that there's always innovation. You take advantage of the tools that are out there. You take advantage, take a look at them, and see what actually apply to you. Your traditional solutions may not be the way to go. Maybe you can find some new technologies that might work for you better. Going through that is part of the process of just trying. I mean, doing nothing is not really an option. So trying something is usually better than trying and failing is usually better than not doing anything at all.
Yeah.
And I think there are two things that we need to keep in mind is that so important. I think that if more of I know being in this full environment, the only way that you're going to get communication going is maybe for the development teams to show what they do. So an opportunity for the teams to show off the work they've been doing to a variety of stakeholders, and it's critical to make sure that security are involved in that show because see, people do not like sizes, but they don't. And so if they know what's coming, then can keep abreast of latest features that are going to be into the solution and feedback from a security perspective. Not to slow things down, but really kind of talk about what are the alternatives, what happens if you don't do so that the developers are actually well aware of what security people are thinking. Along with that, you have to retrospect because they provide opportunities for groups to reflect and inspect and adapt their ways of work as they're going through the process. They could be coached to inspect from their own or inspecting other teams. So they get a wide variety of what's going on from a different perspective than trying to evaluate your own artwork.
We have a couple more questions we'll get to, but I want to go back to another topic we had talked about that I know people are interested in, which is moving legacy systems to the cloud and some of the challenges there, and how we can again ensure security is a priority during that process as well. And so maybe Jeffrey, I'll shoot that one over to you, given that that's your organization's sweet spot. You want to share a bit about kind of some of the experiences that you all have had with that?
Yeah. Part of the concept of going from a legacy development shop to a DevSecOps shop is just trying to understand that the same processes that you had before, like Joyce mentioned, are not the same ones you're going to be using going forward here. The other thing is, you don't have to boil the ocean. Start small. Go through what matters, get your goals aligned, talk to your executives, figure out what you need to do in order to get by, the first day. You get by the first day, you get by the first week, then the first month, and move forward. And next thing you know, you'll be up and running with DevSecOps in no time.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's key to be building those foundations early. Like Jeff was saying, you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to refactor everything completely from scratch because you're afraid to move it over as is. But what you should do is take the time to build the key foundations, for your identity and access management, right? For your infrastructure as code. And those are good test beds for your initial foray into DevSecOps as well, because it allows you in a very sort of tactical manner to start sort of going through these loops and these motions and these feedback cycles to start building those capabilities and actually producing offerings that other teams can utilize as they also go and move to the cloud.
Yeah, Parm, I think also you talked about we talked about culture and the enterprise and DevSecOps. I mean, it's really important to do everything in the construct or the context of the enterprise architecture, because a DevSecOps process it's typically applied to software at this point. So you're getting a lot of the software components being produced out of that process, whether it's an agile process or whatever, and then those components get integrated into an enterprise. And so one of the things that we've done with the 800-160 publication, we took a systems engineering approach to this whole problem of security. And it's really important when you're taking these components into an enterprise, understanding how does that piece fit into the larger enterprise architecture? Or how does that component fit into this particular system that I'm building? There's lots of interactions between these components, and they can become huge security issues if we don't understand the interactions, and the adversary can potentially be taking advantage of some of the weaknesses that result from the integration of the different components. So we can get a lot of great things out of the DevSecOps process, but we have to also keep our eye on the ball of the larger integration issues that go not just within the system, but across the entire enterprise. And you mentioned legacy systems. 90% or more of our systems in the federal government are legacy. They're installed base. They are what they are. And so when we start to make this shift toward the next generation of security and technology, we're going to have to do it in pieces. But our senior leaders are going to have the confidence that as we bring in these new piece parts, they can be integrated properly, and we're not increasing our level of risk because we're going down this new road. I think that can be managed, but it's all about knowledge and understanding of the larger systems and enterprise problem writ large.
Yeah. We had another question that I want to get to before we get to the final question on our list. Somebody asked about how risk will be addressed in the DevOps process and whether organizations will have to revisit risk standards throughout their DevOps process. Are there any comments on that?
I think managing risk
I could talk for two.
Yeah,
That's
kind of the name of the game, right? We're always managing risk, whether it's crossing the street or making sure I wash my hands before, I leave the grocery store. But, just, whenever you have and you measure it, it's always having that understanding between all your members of the team, understanding what you're actually trying to accomplish. Goals are different between a new development cycle. If you're early on, then it would be towards the end. If you're looking for an ATO, that's a compliance mechanism that's a little more strict than when you're first starting out. When you're first starting out with development, it's okay to have that vulnerability as long as you know you're going to get to it here. Obviously, later in the cycle, that's a different story here. But you're always managing it no matter what, and it's just a matter of a different degree depending on where you are in the life cycle.
Yep. The challenges, I think, is that
risk is a very small word, but it has a tremendous numbers of. Oh, go ahead, Joyce. Go ahead.
I think that most of the stakeholders look at security outsiders.
Okay, well,
they don't see them as
the byproduct.
They don't see them as part of the team, and so we have security stakeholders are supposed to. We should facilitate lots and lots of conversation between the development teams and members of the security stakeholders in order to articulate security in the product. Like you said, they look at it as clients. So they got to do it, and they roll their eyes in their head. So they don't see security as part of the state, part of the team. That's why they've got to be a constant force and to the left of the actual development cycle.
Yeah, I was going to say that risk is a small word, but it requires an adjective in front of it to really understand what we're talking about. I think if you talk to Tim and Jeff, when they deal with risk from the corporate side, the company side, there's a risk in the development process, making sure that they can actually build the widget according to the specification, get it out to the customer. So that's risk from their perspective. When you look at our risk management from a customer side, there's lots of different types of risk we deal with, from enterprise risk management all the way down. We deal with cybersecurity risks, privacy risks, programmatic risks, financial risks. But I think the bottom line is, from a security perspective, the reason why I believe that DevSecOps offers such great promise is that think about an authorizing official or a senior leader that has his whole team going out, or her whole team going out and looking at all the vulnerabilities in the system. They go through all these assessments of the controls, and they have to make a credible risk-based decision on whether to operate that system or not. And I would argue that today, because we have such poor visibility into the black box, we really don't understand how those technical controls are actually implemented within the different layers of the system stack. And so any type of authorization decision we're making or acceptance of risk, we're really doing that with a huge blind spot. And this is where industry can close down that blind spot and help us make better risk-based decisions by providing the evidence of their life cycle development process and going through that testing and evaluation, whether it's regression testing, static analysis, dynamic analysis, all the things that contribute to reducing the number of weaknesses and deficiencies in the software. That's all good, because the better job they do there, the fewer vulnerabilities we have to deal with when these products come into our systems and we have to execute in our mission space. So I think that's where this offers great promise for the future, and it will actually help us do something that we can't do right now with the current tools and techniques and frameworks that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, all these things build up to, and I should say contribute to reducing risk to the organization up and down the supply chain is really what we're talking about here. So very, very well put. We're winding down to the last few minutes here, and I thought a nice way to close would be to just ask each of you to share your key takeaway. You know, if you could make sure that the audience members walk away having learned one thing from the discussion, what would that be? I'm going to start from my right and work my way over. So Joyce, you're on the hook to kick things off. You know, what's the top takeaway you'd want to make sure audience members learn with respect to embedding security into the DevOps process? And Joyce, we're going to start with you.
So technology success of DevSecOps implementation of it is worth noting. It's the blend of culture and collaboration with those technical practices that aids new confidence and assures continuous delivery of value. And that's what we're getting to, is a delivery of value to the stakeholder. So that would be my takeaway. Collaboration, I know that now that at Department of Agriculture, is stick to the third power: communication, collaboration, and coordination.
Perfect. Always critical. Jeff, you're up next.
I think that one takeaway for this one here is with the advancements in DevSecOps, it's really important to understand that security is should no longer be thought of as a bolt-on or an add-on. It's just part of the process here. Communicating that with everyone on your team and talking about it is always important. Unfortunately, your attacks aren't going away, but the good news is that there are better tools and options like IaaS, which will make it easier to work security into your system. So, you know, encourage you to do some research to improve your knowledge, get some education on the topic.
Great. Ron?
I would go back to some of the fundamentals. Understand the mission, the business functions, understand what technologies that you need to be successful in carrying out those missions and business functions, understand how to protect the technology that you depend on. And if you do that, just those basic things, then being able to convey those security requirements, those protection strategies out to industry, tell them what you want. They're absolutely the best at producing the greatest technology in the world. And if we convey that in a clear and concise way, I think we're going to be very surprised about the things that we get back.
Yeah, absolutely. And to bring it home, Tim.
Yeah, I would say for security leaders to embrace the transformation of DevSecOps, to help pioneer it and lead it. It actually is a force multiplier for you. You'll get deeper insight into security across the enterprise, you know, when instrumented and done correctly, and you'll actually be able to have your burden reduced in order to focus on critical aspects and actually have less risk overall, you know, when you're doing this in a safe and sane way.
Flawless. Well, everyone, that brings us to the end. I want to thank all our panelists. To the attendees, there's a handout that you can download from your panel. And I do also want to, remind everybody to further engage with both our partners here, Amazon, Checkmarx, and DLT, and also to engage with ICIT. We are, as you know, a nonprofit organization. It is membership from organizations like the three represented here, and from individuals like you who keep us ticking and keep us to enabled to do all sorts of free, objective research through publications, through webinars and virtual briefings, and eventually one day we can all get back together in person and do this face to face. So please go to icitech.org. We're grateful for the support of the community, and we love what we do, and we couldn't do it without you. So with that, I want to once again thank AWS, Checkmarx, and DLT, and thank all our speakers. I'm Parham Eftekhari with ICIT and Cybersecurity Collaborative, and wish you guys safe and a happy rest of your day. Thank you all.